Thank you all for your patience. We're about to get started. All right, is that echoing? Good, okay. Good afternoon. I would like to call to order this meeting of the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. I am Councilmember Brooke Pinto, representing Ward 2 and the chairwoman of the committee. Today is Tuesday, April 25th, 2023, and the time is now 4:01 p.m. We have a quorum with the presence of Ward 6 Councilmember Charles Allen, at-large Councilmember Christina Henderson, Ward 7 Councilmember Vincent Gray, and myself. We have one matter on the agenda today, the approval of the committee's fiscal year 2024 budget report and recommendations. I'll begin by providing an overview of the committee's recommendations before opening the floor for discussion. This report was developed after weeks of hearings, testimony, meetings, and other forms of public engagement. The report reflects the committee's commitment to ensuring that the district meaningfully addresses crime and public safety challenges, provides support to hardworking first responders and community-based organizations, equitably and effectively interrupts cycles of violence, supports underserved residents in accessing legal aid and victim services, promotes data-driven and evidence-based approaches to achieving public safety, and makes significant investments in community infrastructure that we know plays an important role in keeping neighborhoods safe. These investments come at a critical time as the district, like many communities across the nation, is reckoning with increased levels of crime and violence in the aftermath of the pandemic. In both 2021 and 2022, the district experienced more than 200 homicides, higher than any year since 2003. This year alone, the district has suffered 63 homicides to date. The impact of crime and violence on the lives of district residents cannot be overstated. We also recognize that the impacts of violence have not been felt equally throughout the district, with a disproportionate impact on residents in Ward 7 and 8, as well as historically marginalized residents across the district. These experiences also have a quantifiable economic risk and cost to the district. In the case of gun violence, we see an estimated $1.53 million in direct costs as a result of each homicide and $783,000 for each non-fatal shooting. In addition, the rise in certain crimes has led to a sense of unease for many residents, which threatens to set back our efforts to attract workers, residents, and businesses back to downtown and other commercial corridors throughout the city. I am proud of this report and believe the investments detailed here are a significant step toward a District of Columbia where every resident can both feel and be safe. Because the committee report makes quite a few recommendations, I've tried to keep descriptions as concise as possible, leaving the lengthier descriptions to the committee report itself. But I will briefly describe these investments, which again aim to do four things. One, meet urgent public safety needs, support our first responders, and enhance violence prevention efforts. Two, interrupt cycles of violence and support underserved residents. Three, promote data collection and sharing to enable evidence-based approaches to criminal justice and public safety. And four, invest in our community infrastructure and safety resources. First, the committee's recommendations for changes to the budgets for the agencies under the committee's jurisdiction. These include for the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, the committee recommends an investment of $1.25 million for grants in addition to one FTE to support a new Safe Commercials Corridor program, which will expeditiously implement proven and innovative public safety solutions in collaboration with our local leaders in commercial corridors. This program will provide flexible funds to organizations engaged in maintaining public spaces in commercial corridors for the purpose of promoting public safety. The grants will allow organizations to develop community-driven, evidence-based proposals that respond to the hyperlocal needs of the communities they serve. Activities funded through these grants may include increased street lighting, public safety patrols, violence interruption efforts, and other public safety priorities of the neighborhood. For the Office of Victim Services and Justice grants, the committee recommends the following. First, the committee was pleased to identify an additional $3.85 million in fiscal year 2024 and over $7.85 million across the financial plan to support the Access to Justice initiative. As members know, Access to Justice funding supports critical civil legal aid services to underserved district residents, helping those residents avoid eviction, unemployment, and other major harms that can have a lifelong impact. The amounts for ATJ that I just noted actually represent an increase over the total in the committee report circulated by the committee last night. Before today's markup, the committee received notice from two committees that they would be able to provide additional funding to ATJ. And I want to thank you both. From the Committee on Transportation and the Environment, received a $1 million transfer in fiscal year 2024 to support Access to Justice initiatives. And thank you so much, Councilmember Allen, for that major investment. And from the Committee on Health, a $350,000 investment to support Access to Justice as well. Thank you so much to Councilmember Henderson, and want to thank you both as members of this committee as well. I am very proud of the investment that this committee was able to make in this critical program. The mayor, however, reduced funding for ATJ by $18 million across the financial plan, and we were not able to make up the entirety of that gap. And I urge the council as a whole to find additional funds for Access to Justice in the coming weeks as we move through the budget process. Next, the committee was able to identify $1.75 million to enhance funding for victim services. The mayor reduced funding for victim services programs by $6.7 million this year. The committee was able to find funds to fill about a third of those cuts. The funding identified by the committee includes $1.25 million for domestic violence service grants. And I want to thank Councilmember Bonds and the Committee of Executive Administration and Labor, who was able to send $300,000 to support those critical services. We've invested in $300,000 for our hospital-based violence intervention programs and $200,000 for a grant to support the district's violence prevention and response team, which works to address, reduce, and prevent crime against members of the LGBTQ+ community. Again, these are critical services, and I'm hopeful that the council as a whole will be able to identify additional funds in the coming weeks to augment what this committee was able to provide. For the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, the committee recommends a $150,000 amount in grants to community-based organizations, Yay Me, the Trigger Project, and Parent Watch to support community-led violence prevention efforts. Through a transfer from the Committee on Public Works and Operations, an $800,000 investment in recurring dollars to support one's hiring 7 new violence interrupters to provide support to areas within Ward 1 that have recently seen increases in violence. Thank you very much for that investment, Councilmember Nadeau. Through a transfer from the Committee on Facilities and Family Services, a $2.168 million investment to support an expansion of one's leadership academy at McFarland Middle School in Ward 4. I want to thank Councilmember Janice Lewis-George for that transfer. As for the Criminal Code Reform Commission, the mayor proposed sunsetting the commission at the end of this fiscal year, 2023, and as such, zeroed out the commission's funding in FY24 and across the financial plan. The committee recommends striking this subtitle that would sunset the commission in order to maintain the commission. Funding-wise, the committee recommends providing a little less than $400,000 in FY2024, as well as over $1 million across the financial plan to reestablish the commission. The commission is a vital partner in the council's effort to modernize the district's outdated criminal code. As we all know, after Congress and the president disapproved the revised Criminal Code Act, first time in 30 years that a district law has been overturned by the federal government, our criminal code remains in severe need of modernization and update. It is clear that the commission's work is not yet done. We need the expertise and institutional knowledge of Director Park and his staff as we move forward with the need to modernize our code. For the Office of the Attorney General, the committee recommends providing funding for OAG to hire 2 data analysts who will support a range of priorities within that office, including analyzing their civil and criminal enforcement practices and critically evaluating the Cure the Streets program and its efficacy. Through a transfer from the Committee on Facilities and Family Services, funding to support the hiring of a new Family Services Division Chief. Thank you so much to Councilmember Lewis George. And also through a transfer from the Committee on Facilities and Family Services, funding for OAG to issue grants for domestic workers and launch a public education campaign as is required under the Domestic Worker Employment Rights Amendment Act of 2022. And I want to again thank Councilmember Lewis George for that funding. For the Fire and Emergency Medical Services Department, the committee recommends $1.236 million across the financial plan to meaningfully expand the list of cancers covered under the district's presumptive disability law, allowing more of our sick first responders to access these critical benefits. I'm so pleased to be able to provide this funding, expanding coverage to match that's provided in several other states, including Maryland and Virginia. This investment means significant peace of mind for first responders who unfortunately develop these cancers. I also want to express the committee's support for the mayor's investment to establish a new FEMS paramedic school. This school will allow FEMS to train classes of 30 to 35 paramedic students each year. This is an incredible recruitment tool, as today paramedics must go out of state for training, and many do not return to the district once they are trained. I'm really excited to work with FEMS to see this new program established during fiscal year 2024. For the Sentencing Committee, the committee recommends $350,000 in FY 2024 capital dollars to support the commission upgrading its grid system to be compatible with the district's court's new Odyssey case management system. This is a bit of a wonkier item, but I cannot overstate the importance of this investment. Without these funds, the commission's tool for collecting and analyzing sentencing data would be unable to function once the court fully shifts to its new case management system, leaving the commission unable to undertake a significant amount of its work on fair and equitable sentencing in the district. This is critical work, and I am happy to report that the committee was able to identify the necessary capital funds to support this upgrade. For the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, the committee recommends providing $200,000 in one-time funds to support critical upgrades to CJCC's database for sharing criminal justice and juvenile justice information among our public safety cluster. The database is a critical tool in our efforts on crime diversion, especially among our youth. And I'm pleased that the committee was able to identify these funds to ensure this database continues to function as is so needed. For the Office of Police Complaints, the committee recommends funding through a transfer from the Committee on Transportation and the Environment to support implementation of the provisions with the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Amendment Act of 2022 that pertain to OPC. Specifically, these funds will support 2 new OPC employees who will perform the additional reviews required under the bill, such as reviewing and commenting on MPD's written directives. These FTEs will also help OPC undertake its new oversight authority under the law, including accepting and acting on anonymous and director-initiated complaints. Thank you so much again, Councilmember Allen, for that investment. For the Mayor's Office on Women's Policy and Initiatives, the committee recommends through a transfer from the Committee on Housing, funding to fully implement the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women Amendment Act, which calls on the Commission for women to develop a citywide gender discrimination action plan and provide gender equity trainings to district employees, among other provisions to advance gender equality through the district government. As members may know, women's policy is a new but critical component of the committee's jurisdiction this council period, and I am very proud to help move this legislation forward. In addition to the aforementioned investments, I want to highlight several investments the committee supported within its budget as proposed by the mayor. First, the committee strongly supports the investments made by the mayor in hiring and retention at the Metropolitan Police Department. As members are well aware, MPD is facing significant staffing shortages and challenges in hiring and retention. As Chief Conti recently noted, MPD is currently at its lowest staffing levels it's seen in 50 years. These staffing and hiring difficulties, which are made worse by a historically tight labor market, are coming at a time when we're seeing a sharp rise in gun violence and other crimes in the district. I know many of you are hearing constituents' calls for more police presence in their neighborhoods, like I am, and it's frustrating to not have better answers for those constituents. This is obviously not an issue that can be solved in one budget cycle. Chief Conti has said that it could take a decade for MPD's staffing to recover. The committee contemplated additional funding for MPD into this budget, but after conversations with the agency, it became clear that the agency would not be able to spend additional funding, that these dollars would not have a meaningful impact as they would be elsewhere in the budget. So this budget does give Chief Conti and the Metropolitan Police Department all the funding that he believes is needed in fiscal year 2024 to bring in good recruits and keep the officers that we do have. These investments include $5.37 million for hiring bonuses for new recruits and conversion bonuses for non-cadet recruits, $500,000 to support MPD's housing assistance program. As members may know, that program provides rental assistance for district-based recruits and hotel costs for recruits relocating to the district, $1.2 million to support the police officer retention program, which provides tuition reimbursement and student loan repayment for sworn officers and their children, funding for 6 FTEs to support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and MPD's wellness program, and funding for 18 FTEs to support the civilianization of eligible positions currently staffed by uniformed officers. This investment is critical and will help free up our uniformed officers to do police work. These investments are all critical as we compete with nearby jurisdictions to hire great officers, and especially as we seek to grow the number of district natives on the force through the cadet program and the number of women on the force. Civilianizing certain positions will help to alleviate at least some of the department's hiring challenges. The committee also recommends adopting the mayor's proposed subtitle on school resource officers. In the 2 years since the council voted to gradually eliminate SROs from our schools, it has become clear to the committee that we need to step back and reconsider that decision. I know many of you have heard, like I have, from principals, teachers, parents, and students about the need for SROs. It goes without saying that kids need to feel and be safe in school. And when they don't, they're more likely to struggle and more likely to skip school or drop out altogether. I worry without SROs or any other public safety presence in our schools, I'm hearing more and more concern about dangerous incidents happening in schools and on our school grounds. I want to be clear. I have also heard from plenty of educators and students who want police out of our schools, including students who say that SROs make them feel unsafe. There will be disagreement with our decision on this issue, and I think it's imperative to have a full, continued public conversation to determine the future of SROs in our schools. We can have that conversation this year on Councilmember Parker's school safety bill. That conversation will also need to include how we would find these social workers and other potential replacements, given nationwide shortages that we're seeing in those professions if SROs were to be replaced. But the committee believes that we cannot remove SROs without a viable alternative to keep our kids, teachers, and administrators safe. At this time, we need to listen to parents, teachers, and nearly 75% of school administrators who want programs in other committees, including in the Committee on Business and Economic Development, $250,000 in recurring dollars to the Department of Small and Local Business Development to maintain level funding for 4 Ward 2 clean teams, $130,000 in one-time funds in FY 2024 to the Department of Small and Local Business Development to establish a new dedicated clean team for Chinatown and Gallery Place. These investments to keep our high traffic retail and business districts clean will help retain customers and drive new business to the area, supporting our economic recovery as well as alleviate rodent investment and rodent challenges. Thank you very much, Councilmember McDuffie. In the Committee on Public Works and Operations, $30,000 in one-time local funds to the Office of LGBTQ+ Affairs to support that office issuing a grant to a district-based organization to provide LGBTQ+ cultural competency training to district first responders. Thank you so much, Councilmember Nadeau. In the Committee on Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Affairs, $100,000 in capital funds in FY 2023 to the Department of Parks and Recreation to complete the recording studio being built as part of the renovations of Kennedy Recreation Center. This is a very important investment so that our young people have access to positive and creative outlets and activities. $197,000 in one-time local funds in FY 2024 to the Department of Recs and Recreation to create a pilot program at Garrison Elementary and Banneker High School to open recreational spaces to the public by providing dedicated security and custodial services and personnel during public after-use hours. And if this pilot is successful, I hope to see this expanded to additional sites to offer more availability of recreational spaces for district residents. $300,000 in capital funds in FY 2024 to the Department of Parks and Recreation to increase safety through the installation of CCTV security cameras at the fields at Banneker High School. $250,000 in FY 2024 to the Department of Parks and Rec for design planning for a new educational and cultural center along the C&O Canal. $290,000 in local funds across the financial plan for the District of Columbia Public Library to fund a portion of the Period Act of 2023, which will make free menstrual products available at all bathrooms in public libraries across the district. A major step forward in advancing period equity and acknowledging that menstrual products are just as essential and should be just as readily available as toilet paper. Thank you very much, Councilmember White. And last, in the Committee of the Whole, $936,000 in local dollars across the financial plan to the police officers and firefighters retirement system to support implementation of the expansion of the district's presumptive disability law to cover more cancer types that I previously mentioned. $675,000 in capital funds in FY 2024 to the District of Columbia Public Schools for renovations at the Hardy Middle School for the design of a new auditorium and installation of new full-size lockers addressing increased capacity generally at the school, safety concerns, poor acoustics, poor lighting in the auditorium, and student management and class period transition issues, and $1.4 million in capital funds in FY 2024 for the installation of lighting at the athletic fields and playgrounds at Garrison Elementary School, addressing safety issues and allowing for extended use of the facilities on evenings so it can be open to the public. Thank you very much, Chairman Mendelson. Budget Support Act recommendations. Turning to the Budget Support Act, 7 subtitles proposed by the mayor were referred to the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. I've discussed the committee's recommendations on 2 of those subtitles already, which were reestablishing the CCRC and supporting the mayor's proposal to maintain SROs in our schools. Turning to the other mayoral subtitles, first, I'd like to discuss the amendments proposed to the composition and structure of the Department of Forensic Sciences. The mayor proposed 3 subtitles on this. The first to shift crime scene sciences to MPD. The second to shift the public health lab to DC Health. And the last to repeal language in the Restoring Trust and Credibility to Forensic Sciences Amendment Act that establishes DFS as an independent agency. Before I discuss the committee's recommended action on each, I do want to note that the committee chose to combine these recommendations into one subtitle. This ensured that where language in the different subtitles amended the same parts of the code, that there was no risk of conflicting edits. Considering them together also provides members and the public with greater context for what the committee proposes here. Everything is discussed in one place and therefore can be understood as part of a cohesive narrative. On shifting crime scene sciences to MPD, The committee received significant feedback from the public and agency partners on this proposal, both from those in favor of the move and those who were opposed. Specifically, the committee heard concerns from stakeholders that this transfer created a risk of bias in the work of our crime scene investigative staff. That is, members of MPD staff could feel beholden to MPD leadership in what evidence they recommend officers prioritize or what they themselves review or collect. MPD has shared with the committee, however, that its officers are already largely doing much of this evidence collection work. Because of staffing shortages at DFS, MPD has begun training officers to take on evidence collection, fingerprinting, and forensic photography. Allowing MPD to formally take on CSS will free up those sworn officers so that they can engage in the duties that they were actually hired to do, which can help address our staffing shortages that we're seeing at MPD and at DFS. The committee believes that the BSA is not the appropriate venue to make a final decision on such an important policy change. Thus, the committee supports language in the BSA to shift CSS to MPD, but it sunsets that transfer after just 1 year. That will provide the committee, agencies, and stakeholders with time to fully vet this proposal. I commit to holding a roundtable in FY 2024 before the council's consideration of the FY 2025 budget on this transfer so that we can have a fuller understanding of the consequences of this shift to inform the council's decision on whether to make this change permanent next year. The committee recommends transferring CSS to MPD during FY 2024 rather than leaving it at DFS for the year for a few reasons. First, the mayor has suggested that DFS's forensic lab may more quickly achieve accreditation if CSS and the public health lab are transferred away from the agency, providing DFS leadership with additional bandwidth to focus on achieving accreditation. The committee agrees with the need to expeditiously regain accreditation and supports providing DFS leadership with that time, especially given DFS plans to apply for reaccreditation for all units before the end of FY 2024. The committee also believes it will be informative to see how CSS functions at MPD over the course of this year. I want to note that while some will claim this transfer may mean in reality a permanent transfer of CSS to MPD will be all but certain, I do not agree. CSS will remain on site at DFS headquarters and could be transferred back to DFS relatively easily if that is the right path forward. In addition, the general structure of CSS as a division will remain the same, even under MPD. The transfer can be easily reversed if the committee determines that that is the best course of action. Second, on shifting the public health laboratory to DC Health. The committee also approves of this transfer. The committee notes that housing a public health lab within a forensic department is not particularly common. In many jurisdictions, public health laboratories are folded into the city or state health department. This makes sense. The work of PHL includes diagnostic testing, disease surveillance, emergency response support, and other public health services. It does not collect, analyze, or in any other way engage in criminal forensics. It was noted for the committee that PHL, being a part of DC Health, could have allowed the district to realize certain efficiencies during the COVID-19 pandemic. The committee found these arguments compelling and has therefore advanced the language in the mayor's subtitle as proposed. And last, on DFS independence. The committee also approves of the language as proposed by the mayor, given DFS's ongoing accreditation issues, including the delays in achieving accreditation. It is more important than ever that we ensure that the agency has strong leadership. The 2022 law, as passed by the council, would shift that direct oversight of DFS from the mayor to the Science Advisory Board, or the SAB. The SAB has barely met in the past 2 years, and where those meetings have happened, they have been largely informational. I do not believe that the SAB is ready to take on this level of oversight at this time. Absent a seismic shift in the board's makeup and work, I'm concerned that SAB may never be ready for such a demanding role. And that is not intended as a critique of board members, but a comment on their current intended role. These board members, who are volunteers, were recruited to provide scientific guidance to DFS. They were not chosen for their qualifications to more or less oversee the running of an entire agency. We must do all that we can to avoid DFS failing to achieve reaccreditation or in the future losing accreditation again due to less than robust oversight. Getting DFS operational is too critical to public safety and the functioning of our entire criminal justice system to put accreditation at risk. And for these reasons, the committee approves of the language in the mayor's subtitle as proposed. Next, I'd like to discuss the mayor's subtitle proposing to shift the Safe Passage program from the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education to the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice. The committee report approves of this language. The committee met with Deputy Mayor Pia to discuss this proposed transfer, as the committee wanted to be certain that the shift would not result in any interruption or reduction in services. Deputy Mayor Pia confirmed for me that her office already works closely with Deputy Mayor for Education Kine on this program, and the anticipated shift will produce a number of efficiencies. For example, DMPSJ's existing relationships through oversight of WONS and OVSJG, for example, with the community-based organizations that engage in Safe Blocks program work may allow that grant process to become even more efficient and targeted. I have urged Deputy Mayor Pia to ensure that following this transfer, she continues to work very closely with the Deputy Mayor for Education on this program to make sure that the Deputy Mayor for Education's expertise in our students and our schools is not lost. She assures me, and the language in the subtitle supports this, that DME will continue to be a critical partner in this work. DMPSJ, however, will be in the driver's seat. For these reasons, the committee recommends this subtitle for inclusion in the BSA. Last, I'll note the committee strikes a subtitle that would shift responsibility to review appeals of denials of concealed pistol licenses or revocation or suspensions of existing licenses by MPD from the Concealed Pistol Licensing Review Board to the Office of Administrative Hearings. The committee does not object to this substance, but we are going to work with the executive on legislation. In addition to the subtitles referred to the committee by the mayor, the committee report proposes 7 additional subtitles. Few of those I've spoken about already today. On the remaining subtitles, briefly, first, the committee includes a subtitle that aims to address dumping of illegal solid waste in the district. Currently, the code prohibits dumping of certain solid, hazardous, and medical waste in our public and private spaces. This illegal practice has significant costs to residents' health, to the environment, and to our budget. DPW spent over $115,000 in FY 2022 and more than 4,600 staff hours cleaning up illegal waste. In one particularly egregious example, in 2018, a repeat offender dumped hundreds of tires in a lot in Ward 7, causing tens of thousands of dollars in cleanup costs. Okay. The committee includes a subtitle that makes changes to 2 special purpose funds administered by the Office of the Attorney General. The first piece of this raises caps on OAG's use of the Litigation Support Fund. I'll note that this piece is essential to the mayor's budget proposal, even though her proposed Budget Support Act did not include it. OAG agreed to return approximately $3.7 million in ARPA funds to help make up shortfalls in other parts of the district's budget. This subtitle will enable OAG to replace that ARPA funding to support the Cure the Streets program, as well as 2 attorneys enforcing the district's paid family leave laws. The second piece of this subtitle allows OAG to expand its use of funds in the Attorney General Restitution Fund. That fund is typically used to pay out district residents who are beneficiaries of litigation brought by OAG to enforce the district's consumer protection laws. In some cases, though, there are no named beneficiaries of these lawsuits. Think of a class action lawsuit with thousands of potential claimants, all entitled to very small amounts. Currently, funds dedicated to these unknown claimants are treated as unclaimed property, which means that neither OAG nor anyone else can use them. This subtitle would allow OAG to use unclaimed awards from this fund to pay out other claimants who would otherwise go uncompensated, like tenants whose landlords have repeatedly violated district laws but are insolvent. It's worth noting that this subtitle would not let OAG use funds intended for known beneficiaries for this purpose. The law also still requires OAG to conduct a claims procedure to attempt to locate anyone who is entitled to an award in a case before using funds for other purposes. But this will allow that money that might otherwise sit in a fund for years unutilized to get to people now who need help. The committee proposes a minor addition to the 311 system in order to ensure residents can report when maintenance is needed for porous flexible pavement sidewalks. Since this type of request is currently absent from the system, residents must contact their council member's office or their MOCR to have the request relayed to DDOT. This is inefficient and can be easily addressed with a small change to 311. I'll note here this would allow residents to request repairs, not installation of this new material. The committee also proposes a subtitle to require that OUC collect and report data on the number of calls received that are eligible to be diverted to a non-emergency response and the number of those calls that actually are diverted. During the last few years, the district has worked to establish several alternatives to traditional law enforcement responses. These include DBH for mental health crises, DDOT for non-injury auto crashes, DPW for parking enforcement, and the nurse triage line for non-emergency medical issues. This subtitle will ensure that OUC collects the data necessary to identify which types of calls have low diversion rates and improve training for all of our call takers and dispatchers to increase the number of calls that can be diverted where appropriate. Finally, the subtitle adds an OUC representative to the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board. OUC participation on the Fatality Review Board will allow the agency to more comprehensively assess whether staff training effectively prepares call takers and dispatchers to identify when a caller may be experiencing domestic violence and to enhance the agency's work acting upon these calls. I now move the committee's fiscal year 2024 Budget Support Act recommendations and the committee's budget report with leave for staff to incorporate any technical changes made in consultation with the General Counsel. I'd also like to note again that I am moving a dais print of the report so that the final report may reflect the transfers the committee received today after the report was circulated yesterday evening. Again, those include a $1 million enhancement to access to justice initiatives from the Committee on Transportation and the Environment, Councilmember Allen, and a $350,000 enhancement for access to justice from the Committee on Health and Councilmember Henderson. I will also be moving some clarifying edits to the school resource officer language in the report on the dais print. And with that, is there any discussion on the committee's Budget Support Act recommendation or budget report? Please go ahead, Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just making sure that it's all coming through okay. Thank you, Chairperson Pinto. First, I want to commend you and your staff for your hard work putting together this report and set of recommendations. This is certainly a difficult budget across the board. There are devastating cuts in many areas, particularly in the judiciary agencies. And I want to acknowledge how challenging this budget would be for anyone, especially as you take over the chair of this committee facing this budget. I think you and your staff have come up to speed admirably, and congratulations on putting this together. There is a lot in this report and recommendations to like, and I want to walk through and thank you for a few investments in particular. First off, restoring $2.5 million to the Access to Justice Initiative. The mayor's proposed budget slashed funding for the Access to Justice funding by about 60%, and we've got a nearly $19 million hole to fill. Coupled with the proposed draconian cuts to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, this is simply going to devastate what's left of the social safety net for thousands of district residents, either on the brink of or already over the cliff. You were able to identify $2.5 million. I think it's now $3.8 million now after the transfers from my committee as well as the Committee on Health, with a little more than $1 million that's recurring. So I want to thank you for accepting another $1 million from my committee. But I do want to be clear to the public, this is nowhere near enough And I would have liked to have seen a much larger investment in access to justice. And I'll continue to emphasize with the chairman, this is one of my top priorities. Every single dollar delivers improved outcomes for our most at-risk neighbors. And in practical terms, the funding also keeps our entire civil legal services system afloat. Without a more significant restoration of recurring dollars, the legal services community, which is, I think, the finest legal services providers in the country, is going to face massive layoffs, which means there simply will not be attorneys for those who actually need them. Turning to victim services grants, I want to thank you for your investment in victim services funding. Again, the mayor's proposed budget absolutely slashed victim services funding. I'd like to see funding at the full council to restore the entire local funds budget, and specifically, your very important support for domestic violence service providers needs to be paired with unrestricted enhancements for all victims of crime and for the hospital-based violence intervention programs. Actually, adopting the gun violence reduction strategic plan means that we can't decimate core components of our public safety response. That also means the full council needs to identify funding to fill the similarly devastating cuts to reentry grants at OVSJG. Those too are part of fully funding public safety. When it comes to the Criminal Code Reform Commission, I know when we met to discuss some of my budget priorities, I shared that we needed to reverse the mayor's unwise and counterproductive decision to eliminate the Criminal Code Reform Commission. You've been able to reverse half of that move. I appreciate that. And I have confidence the chairman's going to be able to fully restore the agency. Its work is nowhere close to being done, not only on the revised criminal code, but also in revising the parts of the DC code that are left untouched, like the environmental crimes, juvenile law, criminal procedure. They also provide comments on bills with criminal provisions the council's considering. I know there are already several pending in this committee on which they'll be able to advise us. The agency's elimination was absolutely the wrong move, and it further plays into the House Republicans' hands if not fully restored. On the Sentencing Commission, I want to thank you also for meeting those capital needs of the Sentencing Commission. This is sometimes one that flies under the radar, but it's critically important to the entire system. I was disappointed to learn the commission's reprogramming request for this mission critical upgrade was not funded by the executive, but you've stepped up to fill that gap, so thank you. The commission requires court data to conduct research, adhere to its reporting mandates, respond to data requests, monitor compliance with the sentencing guidelines. But without that capital improvement, it simply could not have met that mission. Another item I want to note is the presumptive disability. I could not be more supportive of your expansion of presumptive disability coverage for our FIMS personnel. I worked with former Councilmember Che to fund the first 3 tranches, and this is the right thing to do for our first responders who put their lives and bodies on the line for us every day. The proposed BSA subtitle would expand the subset of cancers to include colorectal, liver, myeloma, brain, kidney, thyroid, and bladder cancers. And congratulations to your work with Fire and EMS and Local 36 to include this in the budget. As it goes to transfers, I want to thank you for accepting a transfer from my committee to fund the Office of Police Complaints costs for the council's unanimously passed Policing and Justice Reform Bill. And I encourage the chairman to fund the bill's remaining NPD costs for provisions included from separate legislation he introduced. These investments are going to fund 2 positions within the Office of Police Complaints to help the agency fulfill its expanded oversight authority. I do want to highlight just a couple of areas of concerns as well. First, as it does relate to the Department of Forensic Sciences. I do want to be clear that I strongly oppose the mayor's proposal to break apart DFS, which is supposed to be our neutral, independent, and accredited forensics lab. A strong and unbiased justice system relies on scientific analysis divorced from law enforcement, and moving the crime scene sciences division to MPD is a non-starter for me. Police should not be handling crime scene investigations regardless of whether other jurisdictions use that model. And that's because DFS is not a so-called crime lab, it's a forensics lab. And that distinction is critically important. I spent years of my time as the committee chair on DFS oversight. And although I know you, Chairwoman Pinto, were very engaged in our hearings, not many have followed along. And this is a crisis in the justice system, and we still don't know how deeply the aftershocks are going to be felt for years to come. We held hearings upon hearings upon hearings on DFS's collapse, and it was crystal clear how the lack of independence and at times an appropriately close relationship with law enforcement and prosecutors influenced the lab's management and line personnel analyses. It was and is inappropriate, and bottom line, it jeopardizes public safety. Every justice system actor, from victims to defendants, needs to know that evidence in their cases is not handled by those who very naturally and appropriately play the part of the arresting authority within the overall system. The council also created DFS several years ago by pulling these services out of MPD in the first place, and there's no compelling justification to go back to the drawing board. I also don't support the public health lab moving to DC Health, but that's a further conversation I want to have with my colleague, Councilor Henderson. But the executive's moves to carve up the agency in both respects is intentional, and that intentionality is to make what's left subordinate and undermine efforts to reaccredit the lab. And at the very least, all my colleagues quite literally voted to support legislation not 4 months ago to make the lab independent. There's nothing new today that would cause us to reverse course. That bill becomes law actually in 2 days. So it's a bizarre move to backtrack on it and through the budget process at that. Regarding the Science Advisory Board, the reason it hasn't met regularly is because the mayor hasn't nominated members to the vacant seats of the SAB. That's exactly why this council reformed DFS, to have a stronger, more resourced, and more independent oversight. This move will return DFS to the very status quo that led to its collapse, jeopardize hundreds of criminal cases, and the loss of its national accreditation. And it will not move it any closer to reaccreditation. Rather, I think it'll be quite the opposite. So while I'm going to vote to support today's overall markup, I do want to make clear my position for the record and underscore how significant an issue this is for our justice system. It's a complex issue. It's been the subject of intense council oversight. And not only would this change represent a big backtrack, it also isn't consistent with the council's oversight nor the executive's own consultants that reviewed and evaluated what DFS needs to regain its accreditation. In that vein, I was disappointed to see the committee cut to DFS's budget even deeper by $770,000 in recurring vacancy savings. Vacancy savings, when taken on a recurring basis, have deep impacts to agencies and are essentially policy choices to cut programs. They are very hard to claw back, especially for an agency that's pursuing reaccreditation. Similarly, I do not like seeing the $570,000 recurring cut to the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. I don't disagree that the ones is at a crossroads and needs to rebuild, but its budget was already cut by 14%. For comparison purposes, a similar reduction to MPD would have amounted to a $74 million reduction. In short, a massive policy decision. I would have wanted to see investments to restore those funds to an agency which was created by this council and committee only a few years ago and grown intentionally over several years, despite significant cuts over time. I really want to underscore for the public the impact these cuts are going to have on the district's public health approach to gun violence reduction. And I hope folks will make their support known for the one's office to the chairman before first reading. Briefly, let me turn to MPD as well. I did have a few questions. And I think you talked about this in your statement as well, though, that this budget, though, that the committee is recommending does fully fund each or every officer that the chief requested, correct? Okay. And from a breakdown of our recruits, cadets, and senior police officers, to help flesh that out for the public, do you have that?
Sure. So yes, this budget supports Chief Conti and the officers that he believes he will be able to hire. So it's 195 new officers between recruits, cadet rollovers, and senior officers. 147 of those are new officers. 27 of those would be cadet rollovers, and the remaining senior officers.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think one of the things that we continue to have to do is, like, for the public's context, is help make sure they know what the staffing level we're funding, what that current hiring looks like, how attrition is shaping up, and then what our projected force size is going to be. I know that we are fully funding the requests for recruitment as well. I do think it's worth noting. Last we checked, MPD has only spent about 6% of its current year hiring bonus and conversion incentives at the halfway point of their fiscal year. So I am curious as to your thoughts on what their spending is going to look like for the remainder of the fiscal year. And then how does that help inform any changes to their strategies so that they, as they look for the FY24 funding for recruitment and for those recruitment incentives, if we have an expectation that they'll be able to actually use all those funds? Because my concern is that we end up leaving millions unspent that we obviously all can share a desire to make sure is reinvested back into public safety.
Sure. Well, I'd say this is something that we took really seriously in our conversations with Chief Conti and others in leadership with the Metropolitan Police Department, that in previous years, some of the focus has been on what should the size of the force be. And I think that the recognition now is that we are having hiring challenges just like every other jurisdiction across the country. And so there is a renewed focus and shared sense of responsibility that these dollars, specifically for retention, hiring bonuses, thinking creatively about retaining our best officers on the force, I don't want to say a new focus that they weren't doing it before, but I have confidence that these dollars will be well spent because the need is so much greater.
Okay. I mean, I certainly support our recruitment. I mean, I helped create it last year in the budget. I think looking at the fact that they've only expended 6% of the funding, though, does make me anxious. I have not seen what different strategies we're going to see. And since we're in this committee budget approving the same amount as this current year, which they're not on track to actually spend, I think it's going to probably warrant continued work to make sure that they can actually get those dollars out the door. Because again, I think our goal is shared, which is we want them to be used to help recruit officers and bring them in. They just seem to be struggling to be able to get those dollars used. Lastly, as I try to wrap up here, I do want to speak just very briefly on the school resource officer proposal. I think as you spoke in your report, this is a complex policy issue with competing interests and on which many jurisdictions are evolving. I did disagree with how the report describes a very intentional process that the council and the Police Reform Commission, which was created by Councilmembers Bonds and Gray, took to reach that decision, and then substantively how that proposal abruptly reverses course after several years of the council going down a more nuanced path with no funding for supportive service for students. I have a hunch this is going to be an ongoing conversation that we'll have after today, and look forward to having that next week at the council's work session. And lastly, I just wanted to ask one quick question about your thinking on the proposed BSA subtitle concerning illegal dumping enforcement. I know there's permanent legislation on this pending in the committee for a hearing. I do support dumping enforcement, but I know as a matter of practice, it'd be helpful to have the Criminal Code Reform Commission's perspective on the criminal penalties in existing law, especially because they're going to be revising environmental crimes soon. And also want to share this potential change with the public through the normal hearing process. It may be there are more strategies to consider to combat dumping that would pair well with OAG's civil enforcement authority and engaging with stakeholders on the permanent bill, including transportation and the environment committee's circles can help us think creatively. Didn't know if there's anything you wanted to add about your thoughts on why we want to make sure we include that within the BSA at this time, but would also like to work with you, obviously, with the Transportation and Environment Committee so that we're aligned on that.
Sure. Well, I think you raised a really good point about the Criminal Code Reform Commission and that some of their work is clearly unfinished in a larger context, whether it be our criminal code, whether it be youth offenses or animal law, corruption. There are a whole slew of things. In terms of the illegal dumping, this is specifically geared towards the damages in a civil context that the Office of Attorney General believes this language will empower them to bring these types of cases that they are already pursuing and secure damages for victims. And so our hope was that we could move this in the BSA and make sure that we can have a bigger impact on stopping this behavior now while we continue more fulsome conversations for larger reforms to prevent this activity.
Thanks. And so as it works with the Committee on Transportation and the Environment, as we think about these environmental crimes, we have to partner with you and work with you on this overall.
Right.
So, all right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Allen, and former chair of this committee. Do we have any other members who want to make any comments? All right. At large, Councilmember Christina Henderson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Pinto, and to your staff for your work on this report and the efforts to ensure that agencies under this committee are appropriately funded for the upcoming year. There are a few things I was excited to see in the committee report that I want to highlight. You gave a very brief, detailed summary and analysis, so I just want to add a couple of things. First, I was excited to see the 11 new positions funded at the ONE's office. In particular, I want to give a shout out to Councilmember Lewis George for creating a new ONE's Leadership Academy at McFarland Middle School. I know this has been something that has been discussed for quite a bit of time around wanting to expand the Leadership Academy and see their great work go down, especially to the middle school level, as well as to Councilmember Nadeau on funding a new team for violence interrupters in Columbia Heights, Parkview, LaDroit Park, and U Street neighborhoods. I hope these new violence interrupters and the new outreach specialists serving these communities are recruited from and for these communities, and that the folks who come on board significantly increase the number of staff at the ONE's office who are bilingual. That was something that came up during performance oversight. As you know, Chair Pinto, that we currently don't have any violence interrupters who speak Spanish, which I think is incredibly problematic. I was happy to see that the committee was able to restore some of the cuts to the critical programs out of OVSJG. This is an issue with this agency every single year, and the budget that the committee has proposed still falls incredibly short of meeting the baseline, much less than the actual needs and victims of crimes, but we were able to do what we can do. And so I hope for, as we go forward to the larger council, I think we should always remember that every dollar we spend on victims and on prevention is far more impactful than the dollars that we would spend on a potential resulting crimes of unaddressed issues. I also want to thank the committee for accepting the $350,000 transfer from the Committee on Health for the Access to Justice Initiative. I think we need to do all that we can to retain good, dedicated lawyers who are committed to serving low-income residents, and as you mentioned, to maintain the work of civil litigation on a variety of issues, including evictions, medical debt, issues in terms of Medicaid, and otherwise. And I also want to commend you for finding partial funding to be able to maintain the Criminal Code Reform Commission. As you mentioned, our criminal code has not been reformed yet, and we still need their expertise, not just on this, but there was another chunk of the code that we still haven't gotten to yet. And I'm hopeful that this agency can be restored to its full strength in the committee of the whole. I do want to mention two things from a BSA standpoint that while there's no amendments or whatnot to mention today, but I do want to talk a little bit about them. Councilmember Allen talked a little bit about sort of what is happening with the Department of Forensic Sciences. The Committee on Health, and I'll talk about this tomorrow at our markup, did not send back the public health laboratory, and we have some particular reasonings in terms of why we did that. However, I'm not supportive in whole of this proposal, which would temporarily move DFS Crime Scene Sciences FTEs to MPD. When the council decided to create the Department of Forensic Sciences, MPD had been responsible for forensic investigation. The district spent a lot of time and money to develop a state-of-the-art forensics lab. Took 3 years and $215 million to build the facility. The proposed changes to DFS in this budget would seriously undermine the agency's intended purpose, in my opinion. The committee report for the legislation that created the department originally, so before what happened last year, before that, in that the committee cited instances of MPD using tools used to collect data related to criminal charges improperly. And further, the report from the National Academy of Sciences cited the emphasis on an importance of a forensics lab being an independent entity separate from law enforcement collecting evidence. This budget and the BSA subtitles would place evidence analysis, will place evidence collection under MPD and evidence analysis under DFS, and it undoes the council law that is currently under congressional review. I'm not sure how any of these changes will help DFS regain its accreditation. And I know we discussed this with the executive during the hearings, but I'm no more confident in their responses than I am now. I feel like we need to take a beat here to make sure that we're not making a move that would harm the agency's efforts to reaccreditate itself for evidence analysis division. And finally, I'm disappointed that we're going to have a debate once again on the decision to roll back SROs in DC public schools. It's especially sort of confused by this, considering even though the mayor's subtitle proposed a repeal of the language that was already included by the council from the previous 2 years, there is no additional funding or additional SROs that are built into this budget. And so I know that this has been framed as, well, this will allow MPD flexibility, but I don't see how this delivers on what everyone thinks that it will deliver on. I understand we're not going to resolve this in committee because we're not all in agreement on that here. So I look forward to a full conversation with the council on this in the weeks ahead. But to you, Councilmember Pinto, and to your staff, this was a tough budget. And so kudos to you and your team for the work that you all were able to put together here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Henderson. Councilmember Anita Bonds.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Pinto, for really taking on this Herculean task. And thanks to your staff for working with you to produce today's result. I can't say enough about what it must have taken to get to this point. And I would invite the public, when you have an opportunity to look through, I guess it must be close to 800 pages. 800 pages of documentation that has brought us to today's markup. So thank you very, very much for that. And I just really wanted to give you a little praise because, you know, you're new at this and, you know, they say they kick the can down the road. So I just want to make sure that, you know, before you set in with a lot of kicking down the road, that we also give you your kudos, because this is a Herculean task that you've undertaken. My colleagues have already spoken about some of the areas of importance, but I want to thank you for what you accomplished with the Attorney General. And I really appreciate the database that you're funding that will give us a look at how Kill the Streets operates and the benefits that derive from that. Also, the unified communication. I think that's also an important area, and the work you've done with MPD and our colleagues as they are making sure that resources go into neighborhoods that continue to be impacted by violence. So I appreciate all of that. And I appreciate also the fact that you're giving attention to the diseases that our firefighters face with on continuous basis. I wanted to just ask a few questions about one of the areas, and colleague Henderson just mentioned the SROs and the funding. I know there's funding in the budget for 40 positions, and that will, you know, that's what's there. But I had a conversation about the safe passages positions and wondered if you could speak a little bit about how safe passages is also being devised to augment the situation we have with the loss of SROs.
Sure. And thank you so much, Councilmember Bonds, for those questions. So just briefly on the SRO piece, but I do think it's relevant to our overall mission to keeping our school communities safe. The School Resource Officer Division has been phased down. And so Chief Conti would say that in that phase down, there were some officers who left the force, some retired, others, of course, weren't going to apply to a division that was on its way out the door. And so it may take some time to rebuild if that's the approach that we're going to go with school resource officers. So yes, this budget reverses the phase down, but it only funds 40 positions, but it allows MPD some flexibility that if that pipeline can be built up, just as we try to build up the pipeline for other supports and sworn officer services with MPD, that we can do so over time. And this would give them flexibility to do so this year. In terms of the Safe Passage program, I think it's really important that we continue to work really closely with the Deputy Mayor for Education and the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice to ensure that the shift is implemented. There are 8 priority sites right now. I think it's been clear, and we've heard this consistently from advocacy with Councilor Allen and lots of people who have testified at our hearings in the past, that there are other sites that really are in need of safe passage attention. And my hope is that with the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice housing this program now, she can be responsible for coordinating with our other public safety agencies and with our school communities in keeping folks safe. But the program, like many of our programs this year, is going to be undergoing a robust reevaluation in many ways with the shift of leadership and figuring out where we can scale up to make sure that our kids are safe.
I appreciate that response, because when I had the conversation with the deputy mayor for public safety, she pointed out that safe passage personnel will be in the schools, at events, etc. So I just wanted to kind of understand how those two programs would come together, and we would still end up with what we thought we were getting originally with the SROs, and that is to have the additional personnel on hand to work with our students, and particularly when difficult situations arrive. So I just wanted to point that out. And I'll close by also thanking you for a couple of other things. One, when we talk about public safety and the requests that we get from the LGBTQ community, that is also important, and you're addressing that. And so I want to thank you for that. That's a community that is very precious to the District of Columbia. I'm one who's been here very long time, and can recall the days when that community felt a little left out, but nevertheless was making a big, important difference in the fiber of our community. So I wanted to just point that out to you and to the community, to remind them that that's important. And I also appreciate so much the money that you receive for the Leadership Academy. Again, I know we've sustained some cuts to the one's office that are very concerning. However, let's see what the Academy can do for us. I recognize the fact that we are in a bit of a financial bind. And so I look forward to seeing how these outcomes will make a difference in our community. And I just think if we're a little vigilant, we might be able to get the results we desire. So I want to thank you for at least saying the Leadership Academy is important and putting it on the books. The forensic lab, you've heard a lot about that. You're going to hear more about it, but it is what it is right now, and I certainly support the direction that you're trying to go in. So I just wanted to put that on the record at this time. And I wrote so small, I can't tell you the rest of this, but anyway, I want to thank you for accepting the little $300,000 for victim services from our committee. So I conclude here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Councilmember Bonds. I'm sure it was a brilliant last sentence in tiny writing. And it was not small. That investment will make a huge difference in the lives of our survivors. And so thank you so much for that transfer. And thank you to all of our colleagues. So I now move both of the committee's recommendations for the BSA and the DICE print of the committee's budget report. Well, and all right, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. All right. I hear unanimous support. Thank you all so much. And before we adjourn, I really want to thank all of you members of this committee here today, and for your assistance and partnership in developing these budget recommendations, even in those places we disagree, and the investments that you've been able to send over from your committees. I really appreciate your work in this very important time in our city right now for this committee and for your partnership. I also want to recognize and share my deep gratitude for my team, who have worked extremely diligently over the last several weeks and months in reviewing all of the agency budgets and crafting what we believe to be a very thoughtful and reasonable proposal to move us forward to improving public safety and justice in our city, which includes Genevieve Hewlick, Michael Porcello, Lynn Groft, Aaron Maroff, Ella Hansen, Akima Benjamin, Aloy Rodriguez Labrada, Anaya Mitchell, Zoe Addis, Brian Romanowski, Kristen Ewing, Victoria Casarubias, and Pablo Velasco Rodriguez. I also want to thank Zach Walter in the General Counsel's office, Errol Spence, Joe Wolf, Ann Phelps, and Jen Budoff in the Council Budget Office, and Kate Blonaers in the Office of Revenue Analysis for their invaluable assistance in preparing this report. This report would not be possible without you all. Thank you so much for all of your assistance. There being no further business before the committee today, the time is now 5:11 p.m. and we are adjourned.